Welcome everyone to Gamer Meld. If you've been following the channel for a little while now, you probably know what the Infinity Fabric is. For those who don't, it's basically the interconnect that glues all of AMD's modules together. It's literally how AMD is able to price their CPUs so competitively. See, the bigger a chip's die is, the lower the yield rates are. By combining smaller modules, or in 3rd Gen Ryzen's case, chiplets using the Infinity Fabric, AMD is able to get really high yields. So anytime chiplets need to talk to one another, it uses this interconnect, which is why its speed is important, especially in applications where cross-CCX communication happens a lot, like video games. Well, 3rd Gen Ryzen actually fixes a major point of contention with it. Previous Gen Ryzen processors coupled the Infinity Fabric speed with its RAM. Now, that's still partially true, and some users seem to be a little confused about this. It's partially true because the Infinity Fabric does still rely on your memory frequency. What I mean is, it can't clock higher than your memory. The issue with Zen and Zen Plus is that the Infinity Fabric has a frequency limit much lower than RAM, which is why higher clocked RAM was an issue with 1st and 2nd Gen Ryzen. 3rd Gen Ryzen fixes this by having a second state separate from your RAM. When you reach 1800 MHz or 3600 effective, the Infinity Fabric goes from a 1-1 state with your RAM to a 2-1 state, and it basically stays at 1800 MHz. Now, I know some have pointed to this graph, but the reason it goes higher than 1800 MHz is because AMD manually set it there, and this brings us to overclocking the Infinity Fabric. I wanted to find out how high I could raise the interconnect's frequency and what kind of performance difference, if any, I could get. If you haven't seen my video on gaming performance in games up to 3600 MHz, check it out right here. Just a hint, it was a pretty big difference, though I kept the timings the same across the board. Still, it matters. For today's video, I tested the 3700X and 3900X to see just how high I could get the fabric. What's great is that AMD actually lets you raise the RAM and Infinity Fabric speed in Ryzen Master. And in the reviewer's guide from AMD, they suggest that most won't be able to get much higher than 1900 MHz. Starting things off with the 3700X, I had major issues. You have to restart anytime you make a change to the interconnect or memory, so you'll know pretty quickly if something is wrong. After being unable to boot at 1900 MHz, I pulled it down a bit to 1867. You're only able to change the frequency about 33 MHz at a time, so you can't do like micro changes. At 1867, I was able to boot, but while running benchmarks, it became pretty clear that it wasn't stable. I just had constant crashes in games, so I moved it down to 1833, and while the crashes were less frequent, they still happened. Before this, I had played around with my 3900X and could get it up to 1900, but I didn't do any tests. When I reinstalled it, I couldn't boot at 1900, so I guess I was just lucky the first time. I could easily get it to 1867 and even ran a few benchmarks. You can see that my memory latency clearly went down, but for whatever reason, games didn't really see a difference. Unfortunately, I did have a game crash after a while, so I went ahead and brought it down to 1833. Sure enough, the latency was right where you'd think it should be, and a couple benchmarks did see an improvement, though I saw a decline in one as well. So what does all this mean? Well, for one, I think it's good that I use both the 3700X and 3900X because it shows that the silicon lottery is alive and well. With the 3900X having the more heavily bend chiplets, I was able to overclock it higher, but there's a chance that other 3900X owners can get even better frequencies. As far as the performance results, we can see lower latency in 8064, so it is working, but there isn't much of a difference after 3600. Maybe that's because the game ultimately gets bottlenecked somewhere else, so the benefits are lost with faster interconnects, or it could just be that it wasn't fully stable. And there are some differences, even at 1833, but it could also just be a margin of error. Personally, I think it could be worth a try, especially if you can get it much higher. I think overall, given your GPU isn't the bottleneck, you will see better performance in games. Of course, overclocking of any kind can damage your CPU and void the warranty, so always be aware of that. So while that does it for today, let me know what clocks you were able to get out of your Infinity Fabric down in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please subscribe, it really helps me out. And as always, have a great day.